Um, it may be finally dawning on us in the mainstream media that America's in bad shape and that they're partly responsible for the information they put out. Now, it is difficult, if not impossible, to solve a problem when one lacks the language to properly describe and understand what we witnessed. That problem is made worse if the language is available, but people refuse to use that type of language. In the age of Trump, too many members of the American mainstream news media and the larger political class have either forgotten or never learned common sense wisdom. In a recent interview with historian Ruth Ben-Ghiat, the best-selling author and intelligence expert, Malcolm Nance described this situation. And that comes from this. New York Times columnist Charles Blow recently tweeted that we're in what we call a collective denial. We are standing on the precipice. The American experiment is about to end, and he says, "I've been screaming this from the rooftops." As for the news media, they're not like ostriches with their heads in the sand. They're literally living a pie in the sky life where if you live in New York City and Donald Trump does horrible things, the bodega still has flowers. You could still go and get a sandwich at 2 in the morning, and you could still get an Uber ride. It's almost like we could require to have the American version of the Blitz occur. Basically, he grew up in an Orthodox Jewish neighborhood in Philadelphia, and one of the first things he learned about in his early teens, teen period, was the Holocaust. Um, um, they have One of the people has twice been invited to speak at Auschwitz, and at the last conference, he said he went to the Auschwitz-Birkenau Foundation and was questioning whether the world was going back to an authoritarian era where we could see pogroms again. Now we've watched this happen in other countries, and we've seen the dominoes start to fall over in the country. I think we're in a very dangerous state. We have 10 months to wake up because the November 2022 midterm elections will determine whether America descends rapidly into authoritarianism and quite possibly a dictatorship. America's mainstream news media bears a great amount of responsibility for the age of Trump and the country's escalating democracy crisis. Instead of consistently sounding the alarm and warning the American people and the world about the existential threat represented by Donald Trump and his movement, for years the mainstream media chose to normalize what we saw. When the prominent voices among the country's mainstream news media finally admitted to themselves the reality of how dangerous Trump and his neo-fascist movement are, it was already too fucking late. The fascist tide was rising uncontrollably. And despite all available evidence to the contrary, America's mainstream news media and other trusted public voices were committed to the fiction that once Joe Biden was president, somehow everything would be okay. In their minds, normalcy and tradition would bring the madness of Trump and his political cult to a heel. Of course, the events of January 6th and beyond exposed those childish fantasies as to hollow hopes and dreams and dreams common to elites in a failing democracy. The 1 year anniversary of January 6th was marked by hundreds, if not thousands, of think pieces, personal essays, reflections, new items, and reporting of various kinds. But in the aggregate, what was not said or written about January 6th was arguably more important than what was said and written. The word fascism was, for the most part, not used. In essence, the most powerful and accurate language to describe Trumpism and the threat to democracy it represents was erased from America's public discourse in these discussions, and this is congruent with the fact that fascism was not broadly or consistently used by the mainstream news media during Trump's squatting. Authoritarianism is sometimes used, which may be accurate but is unspecific, or even the vaguer term populism. Um, the terrorist attack on the U.S. Capitol is still frequently described as a riot, when in reality that event was instigated and announced weeks, if not months earlier, and to a significant degree was planned and coordinated rather than spontaneous. Trump's attack force is often described as insurrectionists, as opposed to a blunter term such as terrorists or traitors. The words cabal and conspiracy were hardly used at all to describe those who planned this attack. In reality, the Trump regime and its agents across the country and on all levels of government had worked to overthrow America's multiracial democracy by nullifying the 2020 presidential election and installing Trump as a dictator. Evidence of these of these criminal acts continues to grow on a daily and weekly fucking basis. Um, by almost all definition and common sense understandings, the Trump regime and its forces were a cabal involved in a conspiracy against American democracy, and one intended to subvert the Constitution and the rule of law and to defy the will of the American people. And when the mainstream media refuses to use such language with any consistency, it's downplaying the dire and ongoing threat that the Republican fascist movement and the larger white right represent. Now, Donald Trump's neo-fascist Republican Party and personality cult, the current American conservative movement, and the larger white right are part of a global campaign to secure permanent white male power and privilege and control over all aspects of life. Now, if they can achieve this goal here in America, the multiracial democracy would be effectively dead, and these rights and freedoms of a large majority of the population, which would include women, the non-white people, the lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender community, those with disabilities, Muslims, Jews, the poor, non-white Christians, and whoever else is deemed to be the other, would be rolled back or extinguished. Now, January 6th of 2021 was a landmark moment in this revolutionary reactionary struggle for world domination. Instead of properly locating Trump's coup attempt in that context, the American mainstream news media continues to describe it as mostly an isolated event, where the critical of self-reflections, self-recriminations, and apologies for the mainstream media's many failures during the age of Trump. As crystallized on that day a year ago, I saw a few examples that would qualify for this. Now, perhaps even more troubling, the media continues to use a narrative frame of surprise and shock to describe Trump's coup attempt and his followers' attack on the Capitol, and I described this in a previous and this person had described this in a previous essay for Salon. A full year after Trump's coup attempt, many members of the chartering class and the commentariat, the vast majority of whom are white, still describe the events of the day as unimaginable, unbelievable, or fucking shocking. Such language and such patterns of thought reveal a deep unwillingness to grapple with and accept the truth about American centuries, the long history of white on black and white on brown political violence. Now, too many of these public voices have been chosen to remain ignorant of their own country's history, and in doing so, they have passed along the ignorance to the very public that they supposedly serve. Now, this denial also explains why so many members of the media and political class refuse to comprehend the existential threat to American democracy that was represented by Republican fascists and the larger right-wing movement. To properly confront the origins and implications of Trump and the Republican fascist assault on democracy, it would demand an interrogation of the white privilege and the white identity and asking hard questions about the relationship between what it means to be American and what it means to be white. Now, such questions require disrupting and challenging the big and little lies of sustained whiteness as an identity and the assumption that those who embrace it are inherently good and noble and innocent. Now, what of the right-wing propaganda disinformation machine and echo chamber? The propagandists and professional liars choose to either ignore the January 6th anniversary or to process the Capitol attack through the big lie as a story of white victimhood and white depression, where white Trumpist patriots are now political prisoners or even martyrs in the war against the tyrannical Joe Biden, the socialist Democrats, and the monstrous forces of wokeness. Now, ultimately, January 6th has become a rallying cry and symbol used to encourage the more right-wing political violence and, in all probability, a second coup attempt in the future. As if succumbing to an addiction, some leading national publications defaulted to the obsolete and dangerous habit of using both sides' language, describing the events of January 6th and the escalating attacks on the American democracy by the Republican fascist movement and its agents as evidence of a divided nation or polarization between blue and red realities. Some mainstream media outlets even featured contributions from Trump enablers and other fascist sympathizers in search of violence and the need for a range of opinions. Now that is a symptom of a much bigger problem that we're facing. Now, throughout the age of Trump, the mainstream media has largely avoided stating the plain facts. It is the Republican fascists and their white supremacist movement that are committed to overthrowing democracy, not the Democrats. And that attack is unidirectional. The Democrats are attempting to protect democracy, however, ineffectively, and they're not the ones trying to destroy it. Now, the media's tasks would have been and continues to be making complex issues more legible, empowering the American people to make better and more responsible decisions about democracy, and speaking with moral clarity and consistently telling uncomfortable truths about the rise of neo-fascism and the existential threat it represents. Now, going forward, that task has become even more urgent if the forces of neo-fascism are to be defeated in this country and around the world. A recent opinion column at the Arizona Republic summarized this. Rarely in our history have the lines between the right and wrong been so evident, and rarely has it been so incumbent upon journalism to make those lines clear. Yes, there are stories that are best told by presenting readers, viewers, and listeners the facts and letting them make up their own minds on what they hear and what they see. And we report, you decide, or whatever the old wink and nod at foe slogan was, but this is not one of them. Now think back to January 6th. Think of the hours after the attack began. Think of the darkness falling on a chilly day in Washington D.C. Now think of the eerie lights of the Capitol that was set against that encroaching darkness, and the silhouettes of the mob that had forced their way in, intent on doing damage and maybe worse. But think of how all that felt. Now think of the responsibility that it's going to demand. And we have learned in the last year a lot about how dangerous to democracy the January 6th attack really was. It was even more dangerous than we had ever thought and imagined. And we have learned more and more every day about Trump's involvement and reaction to that. A lot of that of what we learned through good journalism, we will continue to learn more and more about it. Some people will ignore the facts laid out in front of them, like Trump supporters. Okay, some readers will disagree, like Trump supporters. So will some viewers, like Trump supporters. Okay, no business sets out to lose customers, but this is more important. And this is at the core of what journalism does. And this is telling the truth. And if people don't listen, tell it louder, and then tell it again. Journalists shouldn't do this. Shouldn't do this work as if their jobs depended on it, but they should do it as if the country depended on it, because it does. Now, my expectations are less hopeful. As Republicans and their allies cement more control over American government and society, um, likely regaining control in the 2022 midterms and perhaps the White House in 2024. Many members of the establishment news media, especially what we call the Beltway-style access journalists, will choose to collaborate with the new political order, and they will justify their decision through various mental gymnastics. And they did this for the reasons of survival and safety, or to provide a voice of reason and serve as a conduit for truth. For the more honest, it will be clear that they've made a mercenary decision in search of money, career advancement, social capital, and prestige. Now, in the end, those members of the news media and other elites who are not telling the truth about January 6th, like the Republican fascists and America's democracy crisis now, when it's relatively easy to do so, certainly would not do so later. And when it becomes much more difficult and dangerous, how those with public voices choose to speak about the January 6th anniversary offers a preview of what they will say and do later as democracy crumbles and the Republican fascists seize their power. So if you like the video, give the video a like and subscribe to my channel, RBW King, and also hit the notification bell so that you'll be notified when a new video comes out. And thanks for listening.